The Natalie Wood mystery. Finally,
2025, new witnesses who had remained silent for decades came forward with disturbing not famous or not married to a beloved star. Would the outcome have been different? Even in her death, Natalie Wood remained cinematic. The yacht, the storm, the whispers of betrayal. It reads like a script no one dared to write. But the truth, long buried under the myth of a perfect marriage and studio gloss, is finally being pried loose. And the truth, as it turns out, isn't good. Before she was Natalie Wood, she was Natalia Nikolaevna Zicharenko, a name as elaborate and dramatic as the life she would come to lead. Born on July 20th, 1938 in San Francisco, her roots were in survival. Her parents, Maria and Nikolai, were Russian immigrants who fled the Bolshevik Revolution in search of a better life. But instead of finding prosperity in America, they found poverty. And from it, ambition was born. Maria, Natalie's mother, quickly became the architect of her daughter's future. Believing firmly that little Natasha, as she was called at home, was destined for greatness, Maria transformed her child into a product of Hollywood dreams. It started innocently enough, small roles, a cherubic smile on screen, but behind the curtain, it was a regime of control and pressure. Maria was unrelenting. When young Natalia couldn't cry on cue during one early film shoot, her mother reportedly crushed a butterfly in front of her eyes, forcing genuine tears of shock and sadness. It worked for the director. It scarred the child. Natalie's early stardom came fast and hard. By the time she was 4, she was acting professionally. By age 8, she was already starring in Miracle on 34th Street, the breakout role that would make her a household name. She played the precocious little girl skeptical of Santa Claus, winning hearts across the country. But behind that performance was a child enduring long days on set, private tutoring squeezed between scenes, and the suffocating expectations of a stage mother who equated love with discipline and success. Despite the intense control, Natalie's natural talent was undeniable. She wasn't just cute, she had a rare emotional depth, a haunting look in her eyes that directors found mesmerizing. Her ability to tap into vulnerability made her stand out among Hollywood's army of child stars. Yet her early fame came at a steep cost. She once described her childhood not as playful or carefree, but as working from the age of 4 and afraid of making mistakes. As the family moved from job to job, volatile connection. But fame, like gravity, pulled hard. Natalie,
an intense, volatile relationship marked by jealousy and fiery arguments. She married British producer Richard Gregson in 1990. Natalie, it's claimed, walked in on Wagner in an intimate moment with another man. Ships and her sister Lana, but the press kept circling. Every appearance, every rumored date had ended in heartbreak. This period of her life, though filled with critical and commercial success, was personally punishing. Some studio insiders began to regard her as difficult or emotionally erratic, not because she was unprofessional, she wasn't, but because she was no longer willing to play the smiling ingenue. She had become more vocal on set, more demanding of better scripts, more selective of her roles. For a woman in the early 1970s, that independence was often seen as a liability. Hollywood was shifting. The new wave was coming. Grit, rebellion, and ambiguity were in. Natalie, with her porcelain features and old-school star polish, found herself increasingly sidelined. Younger actresses like Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, and Ali McGraw were emerging as the new faces of female complexity. Natalie was too iconic to disappear, but too familiar to be considered edgy. For the first time since she was 4 years old, she felt professionally adrift. Yet through all the disappointments, Natalie kept searching for something constant, some figure who knew her beyond the performance. That figure, it turned out, was Robert Wagner. They had stayed in contact through the years, partly for professional reasons, partly out of nostalgia. At 3:30 a.m. on November 29, 1981, nearly 4 hours after Natalie Wood was last seen alive, Robert Wagner and Dennis Davern finally placed a call to shore. The Coast Guard was contacted. A Hollywood icon was missing, lost somewhere in the pitch-black waters off Catalina Island. But by then, it was far too late. When rescue crews arrived, they found Natalie's body just before dawn, floating a mile away from the Splendor. She was dressed in a nightgown, a down jacket, and wool socks. The dinghy, the small boat initially blamed for her disappearance, was found beached but unlaunched. Its ropes were still tied in place. Natalie had never attempted to use it. Roger Smith, the Coast Guard officer who responded to the call, later admitted that he had not been summoned until 5:11 a.m. The staggering delay, 6 hours from the time she was likely last seen, shocked investigators and horrified the public. In drowning cases, every minute counts. The first 15 minutes can mean the difference between life and death. So why the wait? Dennis Davern offered the clearest and most disturbing answer. Wagner didn't want help. According to Davern's later confessions, he pleaded with Wagner to initiate a search when they first realized Natalie was missing. Wagner refused. He said, "We don't want to turn this into a media circus." He instructed Davern not to turn on the floodlights, not to radio for help, and not to alert the other boats nearby. The decision wasn't just negligent, it was fatal. In that critical window, Natalie may have still been alive, floating, cold, calling for help. The delay allowed the narrative to take shape on Wagner's terms. By the time authorities arrived, the scene had been managed. The alcohol bottles were cleared. The arguments went unmentioned. Everyone on board, including Walken, offered brief, cautious statements. No one claimed to have witnessed the fall. It was presented as a tragic, alcohol-fueled accident, an unfortunate misstep on a dark, stormy night. And the authorities bought it, at least initially. But years later, that delay would become the linchpin of the case's unraveling. When the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation in 2011, they zeroed in on the hours between midnight and 3:30 a.m., the silent window when action could have saved her. Lieutenant John Corina, the lead detective, stated publicly that Wagner's timeline doesn't match the witnesses. He was later blunt, "We believe he's the last person to see her alive." Even forensic evidence seemed to challenge the original story. Bruises on her arms, wrists, and knees were inconsistent with a simple slip and fall. Her blood alcohol level was measured at 0.14%, and she had taken a small dose of motion sickness medication, likely impairing her coordination. But forensic analysts noted that while those factors could contribute to a fall, they did not explain the injuries, particularly the facial abrasion and bruises on her legs. Some experts proposed that she may have been pushed or struggled. But perhaps the most damning observation came from the body itself. There was no indication that she had tried to climb back onto the boat, no defensive wounds on her hands, no damage to her nails or wrists from struggling with ropes or railings. It was as though she never had a chance. The delay also gave the passengers on board time to align their stories. Christopher Walken, though never accused of wrongdoing, remained eerily silent for decades. In his only substantive comment on the tragedy, he echoed Wagner's version. Natalie must have gone out to adjust the dinghy, fallen, and drowned. He later told an interviewer she probably couldn't sleep. She got up, she slipped, that's all. But for those who knew her, her fear of water, her paranoia around boats, her reluctance to even go near the railing at night, Walken's account rang false. The idea that she would brave the edge of the yacht in the dead of night, while intoxicated, in a nightgown, to secure a dinghy she despised, made little sense. And still, no one moved to help her. Not when she disappeared, not when she screamed. Marilyn Wayne, the witness on the nearby boat, had reported those screams, repeated cries of, "Help me, I'm drowning," to the Coast Guard the following day. But her report, like others, was lost in the shuffle. For years, she was never called to testify. She later received anonymous threats warning her to stay quiet. Some say the delay wasn't just about shock, it was about suppression. Public outrage erupted again in 2018 when Wagner was formally named a person of interest, but no charges followed. By then, the window for prosecution was narrow. There was no physical evidence remained. Witness memories had faded or been compromised. Wagner refused to cooperate with investigators, turning down interviews and shielding himself behind legal protections. Analysts still debate whether justice was ever possible in this case. Legally, perhaps not, but ethically, the questions linger like an unyielding fog over Catalina. Why didn't Wagner call for help sooner? Why were the screams ignored? And what exactly happened in that cabin before Natalie disappeared? The delay didn't just cost Natalie her life, it erased any chance of a clear resolution. In many ways, it gave the perfect cover. Natalie Wood's body was discovered face down in the cold waters off Catalina Island, her nightgown and down jacket soaked through, her skin pale from hours of exposure. When the Los Angeles County coroner performed the autopsy, the results only deepened the mystery. Her blood alcohol level registered at 0.14%, well above the legal driving limit. In her system were also traces of Dramamine, a common motion sickness medication, and a mild painkiller, both of which would have enhanced the effects of the alcohol. Together, these substances could impair motor skills and judgment, but they did not account for the bruises. The report described several bruises on her arms, legs, and especially on the left side of her face. There was an abrasion on her cheek, consistent with blunt impact. Her wrists showed signs of grasping, possibly grabbing something as she fell or someone grabbing her. The coroner initially labeled the death accidental drowning, but even then, doubts remained. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the coroner at the time, famously known as Coroner to the Stars, later admitted that the case was incomplete. He had been pressured to close it quickly to avoid speculation, but off the record, Noguchi expressed concerns. The bruises were not consistent with a clean fall into water. They were more in line with someone being struck, held, or struggling before going overboard. For decades, this medical report was kept as background noise, acknowledged but not pursued. It wasn't until 2011, when the case was reopened, that a new coroner, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavajishvaran, re-examined the evidence and amended the death certificate. In 2012, it was officially changed to drowning and other undetermined factors. It was an extraordinary admission that Natalie's death might not have been an accident at all. The amended certificate cited the bruising and noted the time gap between her last confirmed sighting and when she was reported missing. The revised conclusion didn't name a perpetrator, but it left the door wide open, and in doing so, it reignited public interest, media scrutiny, and most of all, doubt. To understand the weight of this revision, it's important to recognize the context. In 1981, a drowning involving a beautiful actress, alcohol, and choppy waters could be neatly written off as tragic misadventure. But by 2012, the cultural climate had changed. Investigators were more skeptical, forensic science had evolved, and the press, no longer reliant on studio access, began asking harder questions. One question loomed largest. Could those bruises have been inflicted after Natalie fell into the water? Forensic experts were split. Some argued that floating bodies could sustain injuries from rocks or debris. Others, including outside forensic pathologists brought in during the 2012 review, disagreed. The pattern of bruising, clustered, fresh, and in protected areas like her wrists and inner arms, suggested pre-mortem trauma. And then there was the jacket. Natalie had gone into the water wearing a heavy down jacket. For someone terrified of drowning, it seemed an odd choice, especially if she had voluntarily stepped outside to secure the dinghy. The jacket, waterlogged, would have made swimming nearly impossible. It likely dragged her down. Some theorists suggest it was either forced on her or she had thrown it on in haste, perhaps trying to flee. Her socks added another layer of implausibility. She wasn't wearing shoes. She wasn't prepared to be on the deck, let alone out in open waters. In short, nothing about her clothing suggested intent or accident. It suggested panic. Some skeptics still argue the bruises could be explained, that alcohol and medication impaired her balance, that she slipped, perhaps while trying to tie the dinghy. But even that theory falters under scrutiny. The dinghy's ropes were never untied, and Natalie was known to avoid the boat's edge at all costs. In interviews years later, Dennis Davrin spoke of Wagner and Natalie's final argument. It had grown fierce, he said, more intense than any he had witnessed. He heard furniture move, he heard shouting, then silence. Shortly after, Natalie was gone. In 2018, when Wagner was formally named a person of interest, the bruises returned to center stage. Investigators now believed a non-accidental event had occurred in that final confrontation. But despite this shift in tone, Wagner remained uncharged. His refusal to cooperate with investigators, his silence, his shielding only raised more eyebrows. Yet still, the system didn't move. One of the most haunting facts from the autopsy is not the bruises themselves, but the amount of time her body spent in the water. Experts estimate she had been dead for several hours by the time she was recovered. The cold temperatures may have prolonged preservation, but they could not erase the trauma. Some historians now argue the bruises tell a story Natalie could never finish herself, a final, voiceless chapter written on her skin. Others claim they're inconclusive and that we may never know for certain. But the evidence, once minimized, now looms large in the ongoing debate. And it begs the question, if Natalie Wood weren't Natalie Wood, if she were anyone else, would the autopsy alone have been enough to launch?
Over 4 decades after Natalie Wood's death, a new wave of voices began to break the silence. People who had remained in the shadows, dismissed, intimidated, or simply ignored. These were not conspiracy theorists or tabloid chasers. They were first-hand witnesses, credible, clear, and finally ready to talk. And what they revealed turned the already fragile case on its head. In early 2024, a man stepped forward, now in his late 50s, but at the time of Natalie's death, just a 17-year-old dockhand working near Catalina Island. For years, he had tried to share what he saw and heard that night, but was brushed off as an unreliable teenager. Now with maturity, clarity, and corroborating detail, he gave his full statement publicly. He remembered distinctly, sometime after midnight, loud shouting from the Splendor, a woman's voice screaming, the thud of something heavy, then abrupt silence. "I didn't understand what I was hearing," he said. "I thought maybe it was a fight, but it didn't sound like acting. It sounded real." His account closely matched what Marilyn Wayne had reported all those years ago. Screams in the darkness, followed by calm dismissal, and then nothing. Marilyn Wayne herself, long regarded as a persistent but fringe voice in the case, saw her story validated at last. She had always said that she heard cries for help, that she called out, that no one responded. But most chillingly, she had claimed that shortly after trying to report what she'd heard, she received anonymous threats. They said, "If you value your life, keep quiet about what you know," Marilyn recalled. "I was terrified. I stayed silent, but I never forgot." Now, with the dockhand's statement supporting hers, Marilyn's credibility was no longer in question. And suddenly, the official timeline of events, long anchored by Wagner's version, no longer held. Enter Marty Rulli, the investigative author who had dedicated years to uncovering the truth. Her upcoming book, Natalie Wood and the Devil She Knew, was set to present never-before-seen documents, eyewitness transcripts, and a forensic breakdown of the case. In interviews leading up to the release, Rulli was blunt. This was never an accident. The evidence, the silence, the delay, it all points to something darker. And now, we finally have the voices to back it up. Rulli's most explosive argument was a call for a grand jury investigation, one with subpoena power, sworn testimony, and legal weight. The idea had floated before, but always stalled under the pressure of celebrity and the absence of new evidence. Now, for the first time in years, momentum returned. News outlets revisited the case. Legal experts debated the viability of prosecuting a now 94-year-old man. Law enforcement re-examined records. The public, long dulled by the slow drip of half-truths, was paying attention again. But even with new testimonies, obstacles remained. No forensic evidence had survived the years. No one saw Natalie fall. Wagner still refused to speak, and the only remaining witnesses, Walken and Davern, had given their versions multiple times, each shadowed by fear, memory gaps, or the pressure of protecting reputations. Still, the implications were seismic. One of the lesser-known voices to emerge was a former Catalina Island harbor official who claimed he had been approached by law enforcement shortly after the incident with instructions to downplay any suggestions of foul play. "I was told to treat it like a drowning," he said, "to keep it quiet. Don't stir the pot," they said. "It didn't feel right." Other testimonies hinted at how deeply Hollywood's PR machine had infiltrated the response to Natalie's death. Studio fixers, known for keeping scandals out of headlines, were allegedly dispatched within hours. Statements were prepared, the press was briefed, questions were redirected. In the vacuum of silence, an entire tragedy was reframed as a simple accident. The psychological toll on those who remained silent was just as disturbing. The dockhand described years of nightmares. Marilyn Wayne said she avoided Catalina for decades. Davern, still carrying guilt, said that the night haunted him daily. I didn't just lose a friend, I lost my ability to sleep without hearing her scream. With new momentum, social media campaigns reignited interest in the case. Hashtags like Justice for Natalie and Reopen the Case began trending. Podcasters, journalists, and true crime networks revisited the timeline, comparing statements, dissecting inconsistencies. The public's appetite for closure had never waned, it had simply been starved of credible answers. Some questioned whether justice at this point was still possible. Robert Wagner, now elderly and reclusive, remained insulated by decades of legal precision and public goodwill. But others argued justice doesn't always mean prosecution. Sometimes it means the truth. And that truth, suppressed, bruised, and floating for years, was finally surfacing. As the new testimonies coalesced into something undeniable, one thing became clear. Natalie Wood did not die in silence. She cried out, and the world, for a very long time, chose not to listen. Now, at last, it was beginning to hear her. Natalie Wood's life had always been shaped by contradictions, fame and fragility, strength and submission, freedom and fear. Nowhere were those opposites more tragically embodied than in her relationship with Robert Wagner, a man she adored, feared, and ultimately may have died beside under mysterious, painful circumstances. From the very beginning, Natalie's love for Wagner was the stuff of Hollywood lore. As a 10-year-old child star, she pointed at a photograph of Wagner and declared, "I'm going to marry him someday." That prophecy, like the one about her death by drowning, would come horrifyingly true. Twice. And each time the marriage unfolded like a slow-moving film, filled with romance, glamour, jealousy, and shadows no one wanted to confront. The public saw them as the perfect couple. Their press photos were pristine, the beach vacations, the red carpet smiles, the glistening eyes on talk shows. But beneath the surface was a pattern familiar to many survivors of controlling relationships. Natalie, once Hollywood's fiercest ingenue, began to dim her own light. Her career slowed. Her public appearances became carefully curated. Her choices narrowed. Psychologists today refer to a dynamic known as coercive intimacy, where the illusion of closeness masks deep imbalances of power. In interviews, friends of Natalie recall that Wagner often positioned himself as her protector, her rock in a chaotic industry. But that protectiveness, they say, frequently morphed into control. He was known to read her scripts, challenge her choices, question her friendships. He allegedly grew jealous when she worked with other male actors, especially those who admired her talent as more than just beauty. Wagner, of course, has always denied these claims. To this day, he presents himself as Natalie's most devoted champion, her grieving widower, her loyal companion. "We loved each other deeply," he said in a rare statement. "Her loss was the greatest tragedy of my life." And in the eyes of many, including their daughters, he was and remains a steady, loving father. But that's what makes the truth harder to confront. Natalie's daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, has spoken candidly about her loyalty to Wagner. Raised by him after Natalie's death, Natasha says he was a warm, protective, and attentive stepfather. In her 2020 HBO documentary, Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, she wrestled with the duality of loving someone who might also hold the key to her mother's death. "It's confusing," she admitted. "It's emotional, but I believe in his love for her." And perhaps that's the most tragic part. For the people closest to Natalie, love and danger weren't easily separated. They were interwoven, just as they had been for Natalie herself. Lana Wood, Natalie's younger sister, has taken the opposite stance. She believes Wagner knows what happened that night aboard the Splendor. She has accused him of withholding the truth, of obstructing justice, of silencing those who tried to speak. "I don't hate him, but I know what I know, and I want answers. My sister deserves that." Between the two sisters, between public perception and private grief, lies the tangled legacy of Natalie's most defining relationship. Wagner was both her chosen partner and perhaps the source of her undoing. And that ambiguity, never clarified, never resolved, has become the darkest chapter of her story. Natalie's friends have spoken of signs that, in hindsight, appear damning. One recounted how Natalie seemed different in the months leading up to her death, more anxious, more resigned. "She didn't say anything directly," she said, "but you could tell something was wrong. She seemed pulled inward." There are even reports that Natalie told a confidant shortly before her death, "I sometimes wonder if I've made a mistake going back."
The line lingers like a ghost, a soft confession from a woman who had spent her whole life trying to rewrite her story into something hopeful, only to find herself trapped in the same narrative again. What complicates the legacy even more is the enduring love people still have for Robert Wagner. To millions, he is Jonathan Hart, charming, heroic, and gracious. His image, carefully protected for decades, makes it difficult for many to imagine him involved in anything violent or sinister. And to question that image is to challenge the foundation of Hollywood's golden age itself. But love stories can be dangerous, and in Natalie's case, her most passionate bond may have also been her most destructive. Some cultural historians argue that Natalie's death and the silence surrounding it represents more than just a personal tragedy. It reflects an industry-wide blindness to abuse cloaked in romance, a reluctance to confront the reality that love, fame, and power can form a toxic triangle. Natalie was in many ways ahead of her time. She pushed for better roles, she resisted being typecast, she fought against the studio system's grip. But when it came to her own heart, her deepest vulnerability was hidden in plain sight. The warped love story between Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner still grips the public because it remains unresolved. It wasn't a clean break. It wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was a slow, quiet erosion of trust, passion, and perhaps even safety. And the more we learn, the more we realize how much Natalie may have endured in silence. In the end, the question is not whether Robert Wagner loved Natalie Wood. The question is, what did